Hello and welcome to DEI Advisors. My name is Lan Elliott on behalf of DEI Advisors. And today I'm really thrilled to have my friend Jay Shah, Senior Advisor of Hersha Hotels and Resorts, on our podcast today. So welcome, Jay.
Thank you, Lynn. It's great to be here.
It's really,
Great to have you interview me. I'm loving
yeah,
that.
it's kind of fun, right?
It is fun.
And I wanted to have you on for a while now, so I'm really thrilled that we could make this happen. And if anyone who's listening or watching isn't familiar with Jay's many accomplishments, I hope you'll go to the DEI Advisors website to read more about him. And I'll share a little bit about how we know each other. In fact, Jay and I believe, met during orientation of college, our very first week on campus for hotel school. And so I've had the great fortune to follow his career since, I would say, almost the beginning, if not pre-beginning. And I would love, Jay, if you would share your career journey with our audience and perhaps also some of the key points that you think were important in your success. You could share that as well.
Sure, sure. Let me first start, Lynn. And in all seriousness, I'm really delighted to be a part of the podcast today. And thanks for taking the time to interview me. I am looking forward to our conversation. And I did want to thank DEI Advisors for all the work that you do. Very important, and it's nice to know the folks that are making a difference in these important areas. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
So you're going to ask me my journey to leadership, and I will tell you that that story is a long one, but there are some interesting parts of it, and I imagine that's really what will be interesting to chat about. But as you kind of talked about, we started hotel school together, uh, big dreams about the hotel industry, and I got to the end of the 4 year program and felt that I needed to do a little more investigating. And actually, and you may remember, but I my first job wasn't in the hotel industry. I actually uh, had decided that I wanted to spend some more time figuring out what I wanted to do, and had always had a bit of a interest in government and the law. And so I left Cornell and went to work in Washington D.C. for Senator John Hines as a legislative assistant. And I was there for a couple of years until the senator passed away in a tragic plane crash. But in that 2 years, after having been at Cornell in such a tight knit community with such focus around where professional goals were going to go, leaving and doing something completely different, as interesting as it was a little bit of kind of kind of getting untethered from one shore and heading out into an area that I didn't know a lot about, to be quite candid. Um, but what I did find, and I do consider that first job a big inflection point, and I think most people's first jobs are, right, because you go into the world with a lot of expectations, a lot of questions about what's going to become of you, and then all of a sudden it starts happening. And so the first job, I think, for everyone is very impactful. For me, because when you're working on the personal staff of a senator, there's always plenty to do. And so it gave me my first taste of being able to make a difference because I worked on a small team. And a lot of the things I was researching or things that I was drafting were making their way onto the floor of the Senate or into pieces of legislation. And that felt very, very thrilling as a person, in their young 20s. Uh, and then also in a small team, I think a lot of times what you learn is how to be a problem solver because you don't have the resources you would have in a very large scaled enterprise. And so I think getting a taste for having, being able to get in there and make a difference, even as a young person that had a lot of questions about what was going to, about what they were going to do, combined with the opportunities to solve problems. And with every problem you solve, it piques a little more curiosity, and that leads to another problem to solve. And actually, what you find out, they're not problems at all. Everything's just an opportunity. And so I think that first job, it was such a stark difference from what I had been trained in, But you learn also with that first inflection point is that so much is applicable across so many different disciplines. And so I think that gave me a bit of a self-assuredness and a little bit of confidence at that tender young age of 22 or whatever that might have been, 22, 23. So I think having stepped out of the industry for a brief period, and then I went off to law school and uh, worked at a firm as a tax consultant, and then had my own law firm for a few years. But I think that little detour for me, when I came back to the industry, it made me so much more. Um, my engagement was just very high because I felt like I was coming back to something that was somewhat familiar, and I felt that I had learned some new things about myself that was going to make me better at it. So those are my probably main inflection points. After leaving, after I practiced law for a little while, and I'll get back into my hotel journey because I think that's probably the most, interesting. I was practicing for a couple of years and had sort of a mid-scale practice, working primarily with small and medium-sized businesses, and we were a general corporate practice specializing in real estate and construction. Had about 7, 8 lawyers, and I represented several hotel companies, including my father and his partnerships. And so as we were practicing law, it was exciting. I enjoyed it. There was this great sense of autonomy. There was something entrepreneurial about having your own firm. And so that was exciting. And then what I started to notice was that the growth at my firm, I was trying to think further out long term and finding that likely my growth here was going to be somewhat uh, arithmetic. It's not going to be as scaled because everything is based on what new associate can you hire, and you're leveraging the hours one person can produce. And I started noticing with my clients, you start thinking back to finance, and you start thinking back to investment theories, and you start seeing your clients putting that into action on a daily basis. And just the scaled results they were able to have, and the ability they were able to kind of mobilize capital and professionals and make things happen, caught my interest. I had noticed that with the then Hersha, which at the time was 4 limited service hotels in central Pennsylvania, even there, that little journey of 6 years had been very interesting, to go from close to nothing in a new portfolio of hotels to having 4 hotels in such a short period of time. And so as I started looking into it, I decided that, this is something I really wanted to try. And so I approached my father and his partners and explained to them about what we'd be able to do with new capital. My brother was still in school at the time, but he was involved in this conversation as well. He was at undergrad at Penn and was a part of the Wharton Small Business Center there. And I remember it's a part of our plan on how to explain a new capital structure to the partners, which was just an entrepreneurial group of partners. We did an engagement with the Wharton Small Business Center, and we talked about how infusing new capital could allow us to scale this performance record that we've had, and make it bigger. And I came back to the industry, and as I mentioned, I had been practicing law for a while, and I was a little bit new, and I hadn't been around for a while. So my relationships and network within the lodging sector at that point had kind of gone through a 3, 4 year hiatus. Certainly kept in touch with people, but hadn't been in touch with people in a professional regard in many years. But so actually then coming at it and still having some entrepreneurial sensibility at that time after the law firm experience, I just started looking for capital. And at the time, there weren't even a lot of intermediaries, and maybe there were, but the amount of capital I was looking for at the time wasn't a lot, and was poking around. And at that time, come across a series of smaller REITs. And, we're talking at this point, this is it was 80, like 80, yeah, 80, 97 or so. And a series of smaller REITs that come out. A lot of them were brought public by Legg Mason, KBR. They were these small, mid-sized investment banks. And at the time, and there's a whole host of reasons that I didn't go in the private equity route at that time, and instead chose the public capital route. And that in itself was another big inflection because clearly, as we all know from this business, the kind of capital that you're the steward of will have an impact on the kind of investing that you do, right? Because all capital is seeking, different profiles of investments. And uh, so we became a public REIT at the time. Uh, but the interesting part was we still had this private side that was doing a lot of developing, and the whole point was that there was a huge pipeline there, and it needed to be capitalized. And when it was going to be very, very valuable. And so we were able to do that with public capital. And then as the assets opened and became cash flowing, we were able to move them into the REIT at the time, while also growing the REIT with third party acquisitions. And so I think, that capital then, led us to need to have, in order to access the public capital, there's several things you need in order to have the cost of capital you want, which is the whole reason you're there. And first of all, is full transparency, right? So you can check the box on that. That's just, that's very, very, that's just a matter of having disciplined governance. And I think, that it's a great training that we got in our undergraduate programs. And I think getting to transparency and good governance was something that was relatively intuitive. And that's not always intuitive in entrepreneurial organizations. And so I think, kudos to Cordell for teaching both entrepreneurism as well as good governance, because I think the combination can lead to great outcomes. And so we were able to be an entrepreneurial public markets company. And so at that time, to differentiate what we were doing, we decided to pursue a strategy of urban select service assets. And those early urban select service assets were true mid-scale assets. We opened the first series of Hampton Inns in Manhattan, and at the time, there was no other mid-scale brand. But that was all done through the public markets, right? Which is something that's pretty opportunistic in some ways. But in other ways, when you look at it, those were very, very strong investments. And if you did the work, they weren't as risky as they might seem in a headline. And so it gave us a great discipline around how to steward capital and how to allocate and invest public capital. So then that probably has led to the rest of the journey, which has allowed us to get to scale across multiple different strategic sleeves. So we kind of developed this urban select service portfolio to start. By the time we transacted with KSL in November, we had divested of all of our urban select service hotels other than Manhattan. Um, and at this point, the portfolio is primarily luxury and lifestyle with a focus on educational and tech corridors within large gateway markets and some select resort destination markets. And so I think the journey is one that kind of one part of it leads to the next part. And I think as you're going through any new strategy, I think this industry is small and the intelligence in it is the intelligence is rather perfected. So you're not going to have an information arbitrage or a strategic advantage for long. And that's okay because I think it makes us better as an industry. On the other hand, I think if you want to keep delivering outsized returns and outperform, you have to remain very, very innovative, which fortunately in the consumer facing side of our business, we have the opportunity to do that. And so you can always look at a market or an industry and kind of see where there might be white space and where there's a need. And having the access to the capital allowed our journey to develop because we could make strategic decisions and then put capital behind it once we had conviction and kind of build out the strategy sooner than later and then move on to the next one.
Yeah, I love so much of what you talked about in your journey and the themes that come again and again, like curiosity, learning new things, that striving to always develop new mindsets, new experiences, but also taking risks, developing a network, and just being entrepreneurial. So many great themes and what you were talking about. I wanted to dive a little bit more into curiosity because you'd mentioned that a couple times. And sometimes we find as we go through our career that you might need to develop new skills as you move or as your company continues to grow. Is there a leadership skill you wish you would have learned earlier? And if so, how did you develop it?
Yeah, I think, leadership, the leadership yeah, it's a great question. And I was just recently talking about this somewhere else. And I think when I came out of school, and because there was just so much to do, and I was a working entrepreneur, and for a large part of my career. And when you're in that role, you're both leading and you're managing. And the managing is rather immediate. It's very day to day. And when we're in our managing mindset, we're typically prone to get to an answer quick, right? To resolve an issue quickly in order to keep the process moving because we're managing for order and consistency, right? On the other hand, we lead for innovation and change. And so, when you lead, you generally want to have a bit more of a tolerance for uncertainty and for perhaps a slower and more thoughtful cadence so that you can fully understand the facts and think through long-term implications of what you're talking about and really study it and do the work. And so I think when I was first getting into the business, I didn't understand the distinction. And they really are kind of two different jobs, for any person. Not two different jobs, but they are qualitatively different activities, for anybody. And I think it would have been better for me to learn that sooner than later. It might have it might have slowed down some of the decision making. I don't think it needs to slow down all of the decision making because some things are, really somewhat more. You can be quicker about it. But I think if I would have taken time to study a few more things, I might have grabbed onto a couple more really terrific strategies throughout my career that maybe I moved by because I didn't take the time to truly understand, commit, engage, and see if there was conviction or not. So I think that's one skill.
That's really an incredible idea because you think a lot about it's one jump earlier in your career when you go from being an individual contributor to leading a team, being a manager. But then that next leap of, okay, now you're managing people, but then how do you become a leader of people, which is a different thing than just managing them. And it's a different mindset. So I am going to want to talk about that in a little bit. Let's switch over to taking risks because when you left your law firm and came back to the family business with your brother, that was a bit of a leap to take that big risk and start and transform your family business in a different way based on the things you had seen and what you had experienced. How do you handle that? How do you think about taking risk? How do you set up your decision making in order to approach it?
Yeah, it's the $1,000,000 question, and I'm sure everybody does it differently. I think the way that I got comfortable with risks is, I was taught from a young, having a father who has an entrepreneurial mindset, and he was a professional for many years before he himself became a full-time entrepreneur. But he was he always was very, very constructive on taking risks. I think what I did watch him do was he did it very painstakingly. So I think you got to do a lot of work before you take a risk. And I think what we're, in all of that work, what you're trying to do is, I believe, understand quantitatively, qualitatively the risk, narrow down, where the truest uncertainty and the highest impact uncertainty is, and then make a decision. And so I think for me, taking risks is obviously, as you mentioned, in my journey, it's been a very regular exercise, and I think it's almost one of those. It's just inherent, I think, in business, right? Like I mean, that's that might be the fundamental point of it. And so I think we can always at least narrow the conversation around risk by doing a lot more work. And you got to study it. And I think taking risks may be more of a leadership exercise than it is a managerial exercise. It'd be very disruptive, you know, for a good manager to do.
Absolutely. And the recent transaction with KSL, I'm sure was a big change for your company and for you personally. And that was a big risk to take and to move the company in a very different direction and your life as well, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Um, Yeah, I mean, the implications of the transaction, yeah, they reach personally, professionally, and and the implications are many years long. And so, uh, I think there too, it's these deals. They seem like they're long. On the other hand, they feel like they're short. They get done in a year, right? It's a company that we built over, a better part of 3 decades, and you can transact on it in a year. The and I think there's something terrific about that. That it tells you that we were able to narrow the amount of work down, because if you can transact on a company that's been around for 28 years in a matter of months, well then, some of the risks clearly are addressed, or smart capital wouldn't move that fast. On the other hand, we have to think about it. We were thinking about the transaction, as much from a risk standpoint as we were, was it addressing all of our constituencies and our responsibilities to each of them? And I say about that deal, first things first, it was a terrific premium for our shareholders, a 60% premium to the trading price. And I think those shareholders did, you know, at where we are in the cycle, I think returning capital to them gave them an opportunity to earn better returns than we were going to be able to deliver over the next 12 to 18 months, maybe longer, and just for the uncertainty in the market and in capital markets. And secondly, we were able to, have the team all land, and that was very important to us. They're the ones that we built the whole shebang with, and so that was important. And thirdly, for all of the equity holders that were part of management and all, uh, there it turned out to be a very, very efficient transaction in many ways. And by it being a go private and it remaining as a portfolio and the team being in place, it's given everyone a whole new. It's just a whole new experience, going from being a public markets company to being a private equity company, uh, and a terrific one at that. So it's been, I think, overall just a very positive experience. The risk in getting it, it's like there's so many boxes to tick off to get it done. And the risk is, if you don't get it done, and if you're not right and you haven't done the work, well, then it's just so disruptive, right? And it can be very, very negatively impactful to value, even as a going concern. And so, uh, yeah, it was. But I think, as I say, I think the more work you do, you can make better decisions around risk.
Absolutely. I love the idea that you can be prepared, you can do the work in advance in order to prepare yourself and to think about it in lots of different ways. But I also love the part that you talked about. A big part of your decision making was how it impacted the people, your investors, your equity, your team, and that was all a really important part of your decision making. And one of the things that I find so interesting about hospitality is this idea of developing networks and how people stay in this industry for a long time, like the two of us, even though you left and you came back.
Yeah.
And the the network that you develop can become friendships that last decades for a long time. And I wonder if you could share a bit how you develop your network in a way that's comfortable for you.
Yeah, no, it's a great question because, networking, developing a network is a somewhat hackneyed term, right? But the only reason that you care about that is you don't, sometimes hackneyed things get overlooked, but the reality is it makes such a big difference, not only in a career but for an industry. When an industry is well networked, I think you get such great efficiency, and collectively as an industry, it has more impact. And and I think we're lucky to be in one that is like that. And so that's all good news. But I think, for folks that are developing a network, from the get go, you know, my way at it was really interesting because I guess when we were younger, you would go to events and things, but networking wasn't a term, right? It was, you just went and met folks that went before you and had been at it longer than you and were just therefore wiser than you, and it was very helpful to get to know them. And you would develop your network with your peers also, just almost socially, right? So I guess if I take lessons from that, because I love my network, right? Because many of them are my dear friends. And I've known many of them for a very, very long time, despite my hiatus in the industry. And so when I think about networking today, I think the easiest way is to just think about it very organically, right? I think about it as these are friendships, right? And it doesn't mean that the first person we meet and the first time we meet them, they're one of our deepest friendships, but they're friendships because we have more in common with them if we're in the same industry, even if one's in the construction side of it and someone else is in branding, you're in the same industry. And so, there is, you have some relatability, which is more than we can say for folks that aren't in the same industry. And so you have a natural reason to connect to some degree. And I think when you do it organically, then, it allows for the real sort of strengths of their attribute, their character, and their skills to best be appreciated, right? When you're not in such sort of a transactional mode. And so um, I like that. I think it's very important that we focus on networking as an industry, as professionals, as young professionals. But in some ways, I feel like we need to take the pressure off of it a little bit, and allow people to meet, whether it be through activities or group projects or or collaboration on a not-for-profit idea. Well, something that's interesting. And then, of course, there's always the social side of it, and our industry is just blessed with that. It might be one of the most social industries I've ever seen. And I think that's always a great format. The Friends of Friends is just an amazing chain. Um, it's worked for our school so well over the years.
It has, and the network is just incredible. And I love that I've met so many people working on deals, on transactions, even if they're on the other side of the transaction. You do become friends as a result of working through projects together and being in the trenches together. So there's lots of ways to develop relationships. It doesn't have to be what I think of as the super scary cocktail party of 1,000 people that you don't know at the industry
No,
conferences. So many different ways to develop a network.
yeah, no, that's so true. I think, that's absolutely true. I think working side by side with folks, that's just a given. Like that's a network that just exists, and all you need to do is plug in and be a contributing member of it, It will be there to support you when you need it, and and it's certainly very enjoyable.
Absolutely. One of the things I've heard you talk about in the past has to do with, sometimes we are our own biggest critics, and you have those voices in your head that might create some self doubt and maybe have you doubt your experience and your skills. How do you handle that? How do you overcome that and stay positive?
Yeah, yeah. It's a very real thing, and you can't really ignore those voices because they're there. Whether they're right or wrong, they do pop up from time to time for all of us. And um, I think generally what I tend to do is, instead of trying to wrestle the voices down and try to resolve it right away, like, when it does come up for me, I just try to turn the volume down. And what I mean by that is to just sort of think about, whether or not the voices make any sense. And I'm going to go back to doing the work. Like, I'm going to sound like an old codger, but I think when you do the work and you're very well prepared, uh, then all you can be is wrong, right? And I think that's okay, as long as you're well reasoned, and wrong, and that's okay. But if you've done the work, you wouldn't put something forward that wasn't reasoned, right? And so I think doing the work is one big way that I assuage some of, the anxiousness we might feel when things are new to us, or we don't feel that we have our arms around them 100% yet. So I think doing the work is important. And then, secondly, I talk about, doing things with a clear conscience, and I've talked about this, this saying. It's most simply put, and it's a hospitality reference, because I know it's at a couple of the Ruth's Chris bars. I think it's at a lot of them, but it's an engraving above the bar that says, "Do right and fear no man." And I'm pretty certain that is referring to living with a clear conscience. And so, earlier we were talking about our constituents, as leaders, right, in this industry. And everyone's a leader, right? The minute you're working with someone, sometimes you're leading, sometimes you're following. So I think as long as we stay very mindful of our constituents and understand that we're really all, we're all there to serve an organization or a mission or a purpose. And I think if you keep in mind that you're there to serve constituents, then you're generally going to operate with a pretty clear conscience. And, as woo-woo as it sounds, I think it's just a simplicity. And, we can go in and have classes on ethics, and, classes on, fairness versus justice. But at the end of the day, if we think about ourselves as communities, right, and different constituencies come together to be a community, to build a company. And as leaders, if we think about serving them and you do the work, I think it does go a long way in turning the volume down on the voices.
Absolutely. I love that. And I love the quote as well. So thank you very much for sharing that.
Of course.
One of our favorite questions on DEI advisors is, what advice would you give to your younger self? So if think about Jay at 22 when we were both leaving the hotel school, what advice would you give to your younger self?
You know, would I would tell my younger self to spend a little more time with my decision making. I think, I think I got started, you start making decisions the minute you graduate from high school. In some cases, yes, high school. But when you graduate from college, and those decisions, they are monumental at the time. They're very important decisions. And so sometimes things that are real big, or relatively big, you assign an urgency to them. And I'm sure many of those decisions were just fine. But I recall the anxiety that some of them cause. I recall the lack of uh, certainty, not in the outcome, but the certainty in my conviction behind the decision I was making. I, I recall, you know, that delaying making the decision wouldn't have changed the outcome at all, and may have made it better. And so I think I would become a bit more, as I was talking about earlier, a bit more of those. I would be a bit more tolerant of uh, uncertainty to more fully understand facts and circumstances like a good leader should. And I think when I graduated, I probably charged into management, solving problems, moving things along, making progress. But I think even as a young person, thinking more broadly uh, and more deeply about things, it never goes to waste, right? There's very little that we think about professionally that isn't developing us in some way. And so I think I would have told myself to just slow down a bit in decision making.
It's such a great advice, especially as you mentioned when you're younger, because you want to just do everything fast and you're able to do so many things so quickly. But
Yeah,
sometimes slowing down, you'll actually pick up some nuances and pick up things that you don't get when you're going so fast.
exactly.
So, well, as I expected, I could speak with you for a really long time, and we haven't really had much time to catch up over the last 30 years, but I am running out of time in our interviews. So you've given us so much great advice, Jay. Keeping in mind that the mission of DEI advisors is around empowering personal success, do you have one final nugget of advice that you have for people who are striving to advance their careers? What advice might you offer them?
Well, I would tell them they're in a very, for particularly folks that are in the hospitality or service industries, I think it is, you couldn't be in a better sector or types of industry when you're trying to empower you're trying to empower your own success and fuel your own progress. Because, these kind of businesses are by nature bringing people together, right? They're people intensive, and so there's a lot of thoughtfulness generally around people and how to manage, develop, and have the talent grow and feel satisfied while accomplishing the mission of the organization. So I think as just general advice, I think in many ways the corporate America is pursuing a track with such earnestness that it hasn't in the past, and I think it creates a great opportunity for those that are aware about concepts of empowerment, inclusion, how to how, today if we're not drawing from our best and most diverse human resources and our human talent, it's going to be very difficult to remain competitive. So the time couldn't be any better. And I think we all just have to be as accountable to ourselves as we can and make sure we're really putting ourselves in the way of opportunities. So really asserting ourselves you know, into the into the streams that we want to impact. And I think so. I think the environment's terrific, but it is incumbent on all of us to lean into those specific areas where we want to have some impact. And I think it might take a little repetitiveness, it might take a little resiliency, but I'm very confident that we're in a time when those kind of efforts will give way to the outcomes I think we're all seeking.
Well, that is a very optimistic and wonderful way to end this interview. Jay, thank you so much for your
Thank
time
you.
today. It's been so great talking with you. And for our audience, if you'd like to see other great interviews with hospitality industry leaders, I hope you'll go to our website, deiadvisors.org, to find many more interviews. Thank you very much.